Okay. So remember that we were trying to look at experiments that measure the force extension of DNA. DNA is some helical molecule that looks like that. And the experiment consists of attaching one end to a glass slide, attaching the other end of DNA to a colloidal particle, and then trapping this colloidal particle in a potential that is constructed using a laser beam. So what the laser beam does, this is called an optical trap. What the optical trap does is to hold the colloidal particle in place, to specify what it is, so that now you know what this distance, let me call this L, is. By moving the state, so this is attached to some mechanism here that enables it to move along, and by moving it I can move the minimum of this potential from here to say here, which means that I have pulled out the DNA molecule a little further. Essentially, by looking at the fluctuations of the position of this particular particle, maybe I'll explain later how it's done, but I want to do it now. What we can plot is some plot of the force that is exerted by the trap versus the extension of the DNA molecule. So this is a way of understanding what is the mechanics or DNA mechanics, or what goes into determining the energetics of a long molecule like DNA. This is important because there are many biological contexts where DNA is twisted and folded and packed very tightly by other accessory proteins into a very small region. Remember that each DNA molecule in a chromosome, if you look at all the DNA in the chromosomes in a single cell, nucleus of a single cell, that amounts to around 2 meters in length. So these are very long molecules. If you have to take it and put it inside a cell nucleus, which is about 5 to 10 microns in dimension, in linear dimension, you have to pack this large molecule into a very small space. That's done by a lot of accessory proteins that come and interact with it, such as histones. So this implies that the DNA has to be bent quite severely. In order to understand what are the energetics that go into that bending, we need to understand what is the mechanics of DNA. So these are prototypes of what are called single molecule experiments. And these became popular in the early 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, as ways of probing mechanical behavior of biologically relevant molecules through experiments such as these. Okay. So in that handout, what we have is a log scale for F. So F is measured, I think, in piconewtons, if I remember right. So this scale starts from 10 to the power minus 2, 10 to the power minus 1, 10 to the power 0, 10 to the power 1, 10 to the power 2. And the curve that results is something that looks like this. Okay. So if you look at where experiments look a little bit like this. This is a curve from a calculation that we will describe today. It's called the freely jointed chain. Or the FJC. And the old calculation, where we looked at just a simple ordinary polymer modeled as a random walk, that would give you an answer that looks a little bit like this. So it's very far away from the real data. So now the question is, how does one best understand data that looks like this? What is the right way of thinking about the mechanics of DNA at a short scale? How do we think about that particular problem? So let's just revise a little bit of what we learned earlier. Remember that we started off by thinking of Brownian motion, and then we mapped Brownian motion of a single random walker onto a polymer trajectory. So to do that, remember that we first took the random walk. We converted the random walk into something which we called a diffusion equation. The diffusion equation governed the probability density of finding the particle at some point r at time t in terms of d del squared of p. Then we said, let's write down a solution of this particular equation, saying that the random walker started off at the origin at time t equal to 0. And then the solution that we wrote down was exponential of minus r squared divided by 4 times d times t, normalized by square root of 4 pi dt. And in 3 dimensions, there would be a factor of 3 here. So this is 4 pi dt to the power 3 by 2. Okay. And for the random walker, we had r squared equal to 6 times d times t. This is in 3 dimensions. And we wanted to try and understand how to interpret this in the polymer case. Then we said that the time here is analogous to the length of the polymer. That's the main step that we actually made. And then we tried to map the different quantities that we wrote down in terms of this polymer model. So for example, r squared was 6 dt, but was also n times L squared, where L is the unit length of the random walker. So from here, we found that the probability of being R for a polymer with n units inside it was exponential of minus 3 by 2 r squared divided by n times L squared, and the normalization was square root of 3 divided by 4 pi n L squared, again raised to the power 3, just as in the other case. So what we had to do here was to map one problem onto the other, take the results that we knew for the random walker and the diffusion equation, and just rewrite it in the language of polymers with n steps inside. Okay? So n times L played the role of the time t in the diffusion problem. So after that, it's just a question of taking this, putting it back in here, and extracting the different parts that come out of this particular equation. Okay? And we said, okay, let us interpret P of r comma n as the exponential of minus beta times f of r comma n. So the probability, we said, we could write this as a ratio of two partition functions, and that ratio, since we know the relationship between the free energy and the partition function, we could write it in this particular form. Ignoring this, which mathematically gives you a minor contribution, that says that beta times f, the free energy of r comma n, was just this factor here, 3 by 2 times r squared divided by n times L squared, which gave me that the free energy is thrice kBt divided by 2 r squared divided by n times L squared. So this is the free energy as a function of r and n, okay, for a polymer. And this was actually a fairly important result for us. From here, so let me do the calculation that I did the last time, but a little more carefully. From an equation like this, where f depends upon r, I can find out what the conjugate variable is. Remember that the way we do it is, when we have a free energy, which we can write in terms of, say, some force times some displacement, the force and the displacement are conjugate variables to each other. I haven't used this word earlier, but when in a free energy these two terms appear like this, they are conjugate to each other because their product gives you a free energy on the left hand side. What this says is, I can get my force F to be the negative of delta of F by delta of R. Okay? This is the same result that we used earlier when we wrote the pressure is minus delta F by minus delta S by delta V, and we wrote the temperature, the 1 over the temperature is minus delta F by delta E by delta S, etc., 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 or temperature is delta E by delta S. So this is in the same sort of logic of writing quantities in terms of pairs of conjugate variables. So from here, I can write down immediately minus delta F by delta R is 3 kBT times R divided by N times L squared with a minus sign, and this is F. So now if you compare, force is minus spring constant times the displacement x. The role of the displacement is given by the extension R. The role of F is of course the same as F that we apply. So the spring constant K is thrice kBT divided by N times L squared. This is again the result that we wrote down the last time. So now the spring constant, as I said, depends upon the temperature. So this is elasticity that comes from entropy, because if T equal to 0, there is of course no elasticity at all. So it comes from the fact that there are many configurations that this molecule is actually exploring, and the minus sign is also correct because it says as I pull it out, it would like to contract and come back. So it's opposite to the direction in which I'm pulling it. Okay. So I just thought I would also redo one calculation that we described earlier, which is how to change ensembles. So in this ensemble, what I am doing is I am fixing R and inferring F. So the average value of F is what I am measuring here, the average force required to keep the two ends of the molecule at a fixed distance R. On the other hand, I could change it so that what I measure is I fix the force and I measure the average value of R. This needs me to go from one ensemble to another. In this ensemble, I fix the R and I find the F. In another ensemble, I might prefer to fix the F and find the R. So we know how to do this through Legendre transforms. So the Legendre transformed quantity, the Legendre transformed free energy here is a different quantity. That would be G of F would be F minus small f times R. This is the way I construct the Legendre transform. But now I must ensure that everywhere I have R that appears here and here, I must substitute my result for F. So this is how I would do a Legendre transform. And this would be in a fixed force ensemble, and this would be a fixed extension ensemble. F of R is computed in a fixed extension ensemble. Okay. So now let us just substitute very simply. We know that we can interchange one quantity here. So now that we know that F is minus 3 kBT divided by N L squared times R, I can now write R to be minus N L squared divided by thrice kBT times F. It's just inverting that relationship. That's the first step. The second step is wherever F appears here with factors of R, I must substitute both there as well as wherever R appears here. So let's just do that. What you will get is the first term will give you thrice kBT divided by 2 L squared into L squared divided by 3 kBT times F the whole squared minus F times L squared divided by thrice kBT times F again. So both these terms are of order F squared. All I've done here is substitute for F. Since I know that F is 3 kBT by 2 R squared by NL squared, I have pulled that term out here, the first term out. And for R squared, I have substituted the result that I obtained from here. And the minus sign, of course, goes away. So now it's just a question of simplifying this result here. Both of these are really the same term. When you do that, what you get is g of f is n L squared divided by 6 kBt minus sign here times f squared. So from here, the average value of r is delta gf by delta f, which is minus n L squared divided by thrice kBt times f. Okay. Now I can invert this to get the relationship between f equal to thrice kBt divided by n L squared with the minus sign times r, which is the same relationship that I had here. So this is just to show you how you can go from one ensemble to the other. In the ensemble that you choose must be appropriate to the experiment that you are doing. There should be a minus here. You can just check that. There's a minus over here which enters, because that comes from this term here, from the negative sign there. Okay. So the choice of ensemble is dictated by what is easiest to fix, either R or F. In some experiments, it may just be easier to fix R and measure F. In other experiments, it may be easier to fix F and measure R. And that depends upon what is the sort of electronics that you have built in, what is the type of feedback that you have inside your system. So depending upon that, you can choose either one or the other ensemble. This one here? This one here? That should have a minus sign. Didn't I have a minus sign? So you're saying this should be a plus over here? Yes, that should be right. So on my notes I have a minus sign. So what could have gone wrong?
Because when we take a derivative here,
Yeah.
there will be a minus that comes.
Where?
Dou gf by dou f. So
Yeah.
that will be is equal to minus r, provided we have a minus here. If this is a plus, we will get a plus there.
Yeah, but there should be a minus there. So I'm not sure where I have.
Our conjugate variables written like this, minus of dou f by dou r.
It's possible that the error that I have made is in this sign here. And maybe that is the problem, because yes, I think that's correct. That's probably the problem. Because, for example, if P is delta U by delta V with a minus sign, but when I go to the enthalpy, I have U plus P. So this minus sign here transits into a plus when I write down the form of the enthalpy. Which means that I should have a plus here and therefore a minus sign, because I initially defined this with a minus sign. over here. Therefore, my error is in taking this to be a minus, it should have been a plus, this should be a minus, and then everything else goes through. Okay. So now what we've done really is essentially ask questions about the end-to-end distance r of a polymer with n steps, each of size L. In many cases, however, the more sensible question to ask is, what is the weight or the statistical weight of a configuration of the polymer? That is to say, instead of just the end-to-end vector here, I want to ask what is the configuration R of S of the polymer, where S is some quantity that is measured along the length of the polymer. It's like some quantity that measures the distance that I move internally along the polymer. And this R of S says, if I have moved S units away from here, what is the distance between the origin and that particular point? Okay, so this is a more detailed version of that. And earlier what we had called R was R at S equal to L minus R at 0. So now you can see that what we have been calculating here is a somewhat more general property. If I know R is a function of S, the full shape of R, I can compute and what is the probability of having a particular configuration R of S. Then from here I can generate the moments R squared, R cubed, etc. just because I know this particular relationship.
So, do ensemble means a group of?
Okay, that's a good question. What I mean here is the word ensemble is used typically for many copies of the system. So it's a sort of mental way of saying, let me imagine doing this experiment in parallel in many different ways. So in detail, the noise here may not be the noise here, may not be the noise here, may not be the noise in some other copy of the system. So statistically I can say, let me look at the system instantaneously here, 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 and average all of that. So the idea is the measurement on any one of these, one real experimental measurement, is the same in equilibrium as taking lots of snapshots of the system and averaging over those. So the idea of the ensemble is kind of nice because it says you don't have to follow in time what this is doing. It's enough if you understand the statistical weight of this versus this versus this versus this, which is like taking lots of copies of the system, looking to see what the system is doing at any time in each of those copies and averaging over those copies, which is why the idea of the ensemble, which is why I use the word ensemble here. An ensemble I can fix according to a particular constraint. For example, I can look at all ensembles of systems in which I put a potential and the size 0 of the potential is the same distance r in each of these pictures. So then I would have fixed R and tried to measure the force that is trying to pull the polymer back. Okay. So that's what I mean by ensemble. It's many copies of the system with the understanding that I can measure any quantity in equilibrium by just averaging over those multiple copies. So in order to justify the form that we will take for P of R of S, let's choose one simple model of a polymer which is made up of sort of beads with springs connecting them. So this is called a bead spring model. I'm even going to ignore the sizes of these beads. It's just drawn to illustrate a point, and just imagine that these are point sites that are connected by a particular spring. Okay? So let us suppose that the potential between successive beads is U of R is thrice kBt R squared divided by L squared, and there should be a factor of 2. So this is the distance Ri, say between bead I and between I plus 1. So this is like a spring that says the minimum energy of the spring is when it's completely contracted to 0. If I pull it out to a distance r, it has an energy that increases quadratically with that r. This is just my imagination of what a potential is between two successive beads. So it's a spring with equilibrium length 0, or where the t equal to 0 value of this is just 0. So all those points collapse onto 1. Of course, in equilibrium at some finite temperature T, these things will fluctuate about that and will be larger than 0 typically. Okay? So suppose for one particular bead here, spring here, and another bead here, the probability of finding a certain extension of the bead Ri is proportional to the exponential of minus beta times epsilon of Ri, or beta in this case U of Ri. So this is a result that you're now familiar with. This is a standard result due to Boltzmann. I don't know if I remember if I use this word, but this is called a Boltzmann weight. This way of assigning a certain exponential of minus beta times energy to the probability here is called a Boltzmann weight. And this distribution is called the Boltzmann distribution. So first of all, we must normalize this correctly because this is a probability. So the probability of having the two ends of the bead separated by distance Ri is exponential of minus 3 kBt R squared divided by twice L squared. And the factor of beta, of course, kills this. So this should be beta times kBt. I can delete both the beta and the kBt. And over here I have a square root. I have not a square root, a 3 over pi L squared. I think there should be a factor of 2. Yeah. 3 over 2 pi L squared raised to the power 3 by 2. Okay. That's just putting the right normalization in. So from here, the average value of R squared is just L squared. So this is should be a vector here, should be a vector here. This is by just comparing these two from the relation that we already know for a Gaussian function. Suppose now I have a whole bunch of independent such bond vectors, each of this have this particular probability. Then the probability of having a particular set of bond vectors Ri, and let's suppose there are n of them together. This is just a product overall I equal to 1 to n times these individual expressions. So that's 3 over 2 pi L squared whole raised to the power 3 by 2 times e to the power minus 3 by 2 L squared times Ri squared. Is that okay? Each of these, so I'm saying I'm going to make up these little Ri. This is Ri, the first Ri, this is the second Ri, the third Ri, the fourth Ri, the fifth Ri. Each of these are independent of each other. So the probability of having any set is just the product of their individual probabilities. So the first R1 has some value, e to the power minus b 3 by 2 L square R1 square. The second has another value, third has another value, and the total probability for any set of Ri, given that there are n of them, is just the product over n such terms of terms that look like that, where I appears there. Okay. And now this I can simplify a little bit. To write psi of the set Ri comma n is just that first term, which is 3 over 2 pi L squared whole raised to the power 3n by 2. That is just this product over these n terms here, times now that second product over I equal to 1 to n, e to the power minus 3 by 2 Ri squared divided by L squared, which I can write as 3, sorry, oh I called it, sorry, what I meant is p, it's the same thing. Which is 3 over 2 pi L squared.
Why did you put a capital in
Just a sec, 1 sec. Yeah.
Why do you get a capital on the power? Because okay, it's
So this has n steps. I'm multiplying this, so there are n terms that I'm multiplying. So I have to raise that whole object to n. So finally, what I get is a term that looks like this. Okay. Let's look at this term here. Sum over I, Ri squared. Remember that Ri is the distance between this speed and this speed, 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 etc. So this is just R2 minus R1 squared plus R3 minus R2 squared, and so on and so forth. Okay? It's just each of those terms taken together. Yeah, the capital R, I'll just tell you, I will just draw it out a little neater. So here is my coordinate system. Here is my polymer. This is R1, this is R2, this is R3, where R1, R2, R3 are vectors that look like this. Okay? What I called R1 is this vector here, which is R2 minus R1, and similarly R2 is R3 minus R2, which is this vector here. So far, we have been writing an expression for the weight for this particular vector here. Those are the small p's that we wrote down at that point. But now I can go back and write them in terms of these r's. Okay? So now let's imagine taking this factor of L squared inside. So what I have is a term that looks like Ri plus 1 minus Ri divided by L, the whole squared. Because each of these terms are individually squared. And then I've just taken the L from outside and put it inside there. Now I'm going to take the limit where earlier I sort of thought of these as being well separated. But now I can say that, look, I'm just going to take my R closer and closer and closer together until finally my beads look like this. Okay? In that limit, this becomes the gradient of R, or the derivative of R, with respect to the internal coordinate S. So this quantity becomes dr of S by ds the whole squared. Okay? We have to be a little careful about what we do with that summation here. I don't want to get into a lot of detail regarding that. So what we really need to do is to take the sum over I and convert it to an integral over S divided by this size L in the limit that this monomer size goes to 0, in which case I can take the summation. So what I'm saying is I'm going to take a very, very large number of beads, put them closer and closer together until finally this approximates something that looks like a continuous curve R of S. So the only question is how mathematically do I do that in a systematic manner that is clear and clean. So to do that I need to be a little careful about my factors of L and where they appear. So I will write down the final answer for you, and what you will finally get is that the probability of having some sequence of R's in the continuum limit of n is L divided by the small l here. This is proportional to e to the power minus 3 by 2 times the small l integral between 0 and L of d Rs by ds the whole squared times ds. So let me just, since I've written it down, let me just go down and explain what this is. So this is P now of R of S. So what I've done is I have said that take the number of units n, multiply this by the small l to get a capital L. Okay? So the sum over I equal to 1 to n now becomes an integral up to capital L. These other factors of how the sum becomes this particular integral, you have to work through a little carefully to make sure that all these factors of L are well behaved and have been correctly included. But now what you can see is once you go through that algebra, now you have been able to write the probability weight for a particular trajectory in a polymer with length L as proportional to exponential of minus 3 divided by twice small l integral up to that L dr of S by ds the whole squared times ds. And now this is in terms of the polymer trajectory R of S, where this is an internal coordinate along the polymer.
When we define small l here,
Yeah.
that is equivalent.
When we define small l here, we said that this is some sort of basic unit size here.
And S is how is S related to small l?
S is a quantity that is proportional to the internal distance that you have to go. So S goes all the way from 0 right up to capital L. Okay? So we have to do this carefully because always whenever we go from defining things discretely to defining them in the continuum, that presupposes that you have to take n going to be very large, this distance to be very small between these individual units in such a way as to keep the product sensible. Okay? So if you do that, what you will do is wind up with something like this. The only thing that I have not really specified is, I have said this is proportional to, but I haven't told you how to calculate that proportionality constant. And that unfortunately would take us a little far away from our the thrust of this course, because that will have to tell you about how we compute these quantities for polymers. So let's just not do that. We will just use this just to remind ourselves of how the weight for something that is a continuous function R of S, how the weight for a polymer, given that I've specified what the R is at every S between 0 and L, what this quantity looks like. That is just proportional to this particular relationship here, dr by ds. So again, a bit of notation here, R is a vector, so dr by ds is itself a vector. So what I need here is take the modulus squared of this, which really means the same as take dr by ds, take the dot product of that with dr by ds, which is really gives you the modulus squared of that vector. So this is just notational information here. So two things I haven't told you. First of all, this is the probability of having a certain R of S for a polymer of length L. I should be able to calculate things with this probability, which means I should normalize it correctly. So we haven't been very specific about what that normalization is. But I will just give you one answer, which is if you calculate what is the probability of having an end-to-end distance R. So this is an end-to-end distance. And from here, calculate what is R squared averaged using these ideas here. So remember that we said that the end-to-end distance R was R at S equal to L minus R of 0. Take this, square it, and then average it. And this average is to be done with respect to the probability of R of S, comma L, the same quantity that we wrote down there. So if we do this, and I haven't done this yet, what we would do is find a way of writing this particular quantity R as a sum over I equal to 1 to n of the small Ri, just sort of adding up all of these little vectors along the line to find the total distance that you go from beginning to end. Take this, write it in the continuum relationship, and then calculate this. What you will get is the same as the relationship that we got earlier, which is e to the power minus 3 kBt divided by n L squared times R squared with the proportionality outside. So I haven't showed you how we'll get this, but the answer is that you do get it. Oh, sorry, this is not R squared. R squared is n times L squared, which is L times L. So this is R squared proportional to this, which goes back to the old result that we had earlier. Okay? So this approach to polymers is called the Gaussian chain. And many numerical approaches to simulating polymers start with ideas like this, that you have some beads here, you connect them by springs. And this defines the configuration R of S of the polymer. As you move along the chain, as you move along these beads, the configuration is given by a set of vectors here, 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 etc. And in the limit where the number of beads become very large, this approaches the smooth function R of S, which is one trajectory of the polymer. So now let's just do one particular calculation with the aim of trying to understand, as we described earlier, what is the relationship between force and extension for DNA. And that model is called the freely jointed chain. In this model, I imagine that the polymer sequence is just a sequence of vectors like this, all of which have the same length. Okay? So this is now a discrete model again, not talking about a continuum model. But now I have fixed length polymers between here and here, and I apply a uniform force in this direction. Each of these are now independent of each other.
Why was this called a Gaussian chain?
So it's called a Gaussian chain because the probability of having an individual Ri was proportional to minus Ri squared. That is where the Gaussian came in. each of these was independent of each other. Okay?
In this freely jointed chain, there are no beads in between.
There are no beads in between, it's just sort of points like this with vectors, and each of these have a fixed distance here. Okay? So if I take this fixed distance to be 1, then each of these vectors can point anywhere on the surface of a sphere. All of those are allowed. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to imagine that I'm applying a force along the z direction, and the energy, of course, it's lowest energy to try and align with this here, but if it's at any distance away, there is some energy proportional to the theta, the amount by which I move away from it. And this energy is the same irrespective of where this is. It could be anywhere on a cone in this direction, which means your phi is free to vary by a factor of 2 pi, anywhere within 2 pi.
Is Boltzmann distribution similar to Gaussian?
Similar to?
Gaussian.
No, the Boltzmann distribution just says that the probability of finding the system in some energy state epsilon I is proportional to minus exponential minus beta epsilon I. That's all the Boltzmann distribution is. This is a Boltzmann weight for a particular state, and this is what the Boltzmann distribution specifies. So that has nothing. We use this result in order to compute the statistical weight of configurations, but this is more general than that.
In the last time when we said that u of Ri goes in the place of the potential, right?
That's correct. So because we said that the only energy came from the extension of the spring between these 2 points, and that energy was u of Ri. So what must appear here must be u of Ri, because that's the only way where the energy appears. We didn't worry about any momentum or any other aspect of this. We just said that the energy of a configuration of a R dependently upon u of R, where we specified what u of R was. Okay? Okay, so now let's just try and understand what happens when we take a vector here. This is at an angle to some theta, to some direction where the force is being applied. So let me write down the energy to be minus the force times the cosine of theta I. Okay? So when this is perfectly aligned with this is the lowest energy, it's minus f. Because theta equal to 0 is cos theta equal to 1. The moment I move away from this, I pay more energy proportional to the amount of theta. So this is basically, suppose this is some vector r. The energy is proportional to r dot f with a minus sign, where f is a force in this direction. So I've just chosen for convenience this force to be along the z direction, which means I can use the standard spherical polar coordinates to describe it. Or I define my z direction to be the direction of the force. So the partition function for just one of these little vectors is an integral over all values of phi and integral over all values of theta. So this is between 0 to pi, let us say this is between 0 and 2 pi, times the exponential of beta times f times cosine of theta. Okay? This should be e to the power minus beta times the energy. The minus goes with this minus here. The f cos theta comes out here, and I have beta that sticks there.
What is P?
Hmm?
P, small p.
Small?
Is that dp?
d5.
D phi,
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
So here that is the azimuthal angle. This is called the polar angle. This angle here is called the azimuthal angle phi. And the energy doesn't depend upon that. And sometimes it's convenient to sort of put in the size of this bond itself here. So if the size of this is a, I can put an a here. That just contributes a beta f a times cos theta, where this is the bond size. Okay? I can do this integral. This particular integral, of course, is the easiest one. This just gives me a factor of 2 pi. The second integral here can be written as minus 1 to 1 d of cos theta e to the power minus beta f plus beta f a times cosine theta, which I can write very simply as 2 pi times e to the power beta f a minus e to the power minus beta f a divided by beta times f times a. That's what I get from integrating that.
Why did you get d of cos theta?
Because I can write, okay, technically, sorry, good question. This should be sine theta d theta d phi. Okay? Because remember that I said that this vector could vary anywhere on the surface of a sphere. So when I do the integral over all states that it can take, this will be r squared sine theta d phi. R is 1 because that is a factor of a squared that comes out over here. So I'm only integrating over the angle that I'm allowed to do.
One integral is like this and the other is like this.
Yeah. So the integral that is the azimuthal integral gives me 2 pi. The polar integral is between 0 and pi d theta sine theta. But this I can write as d of cos theta. Because sine theta d theta, I can write as d of cos theta. The reason I might want to do that is because I have a cos theta here. So now I can just substitute cos theta equal to u. This has become e to the power minus beta f a times u du here. Now all I need to do is to keep track of the limits on this particular integral. Once I do that, it's easy to do this integral and pull that factor out. So this is just a partition function for one of these little spins. But I said there are all these spins here, all of these little vectors here, they're all independent of each other. So the partition function for n of these vectors is just a partition function for the first one, into the partition function for the second one, into the partition function for the third one. But all of these are the same. So this is just partition function for the 1 raised to the power n. Okay? Because I have cos theta 1, I have theta 1, theta 2, theta 3, theta 4, theta 5 for each one of these vectors here. And they're all independent integrals. So I can do that integral very simply and finally get an answer where g of f is minus n kbt times the log 4 pi sine hyperbolic beta f a divided by beta times f times a. So that comes from the fact that this quantity here is twice sine hyperbolic beta f a. Okay? The factor of 2 combines with this quantity here to give me a factor of 4 pi. The beta f a is one that I have obtained from here to here, and force is minus, remember that the free energy is minus kBt times log of z. So that n factor comes out here. So this is just doing the simple algebra that corresponds to that quantity there.
But why did you write down the partition function?
Because I finally wanted to get the free energy. So this is the free energy of the system corresponding to applying a fixed force between the two ends in this particular model of a polymer called the freely jointed chain. Okay. So there's a little bit of algebra here that computes the extension R from minus delta GF by delta F. If you do that, what you will get is the answer. I'll just write down the answer and you can check it. R averaged is n times A times the cotangent hyperbolic of FA divided by KBT minus KBT divided by F times A. So now this is an answer to what happens when you apply a force in this model of a polymer, in the freely jointed chain model of a polymer. Let's try and understand each of these terms. So let's understand what happens to the cotine hyperbolic function when the argument is very small, when the force is very small. So cotangent hyperbolic of x is x plus x cubed divided by 3 for small x, which is the same as f tending to 0. So for very small f, I can always expand this in terms of this expansion. The first term goes away because, so it should be 1 by x plus x cubed by 3. So if I do that, cotangent hyperbolic of Fa divided by kBt is approximately kBt divided by f times A plus f times A divided by thrice kBt. Yeah. Is it x cubed or is it, sorry, this is not even a cube. This is just x by 3. I knew there was something wrong. Okay. This term cancels with this term here. So for small f, the average value of the extension is n times A times f A divided by thrice kBt. Somewhere along the line, there's a minus sign here, which we thought to come here, technically speaking, to be completely consistent. So this implies that f is thrice kBt divided by n times a squared times r with a minus sign. If you remember, this is exactly the form that we had earlier, except that instead of a, we use the quantity L. So 3 kBt by NL squared times R is the same relationship that we wrote down earlier. Again, remember, the physics of this is just the same. I said any polymer, if you pull on it small enough not to pull it out together, it will always have a force extension relationship that looks like a spring, but the spring constant is proportional to the temperature. So it's exactly the same relationship that we had earlier, pointing to the fact that our approach is general. So that is the same as saying that if I plot the force versus extension curve for a polymer, for small forces, I will always have the 3 kBt divided by NL squared behavior. Irrespective, this is not enough to tell me about different models of polymers. When we drew, if you look at that relationship that we drew there, we had some relationship that looked like that, some model for a polymer that went like this and so on. But in this particular case, all of them will behave the same way in this particular region, where the behavior is mainly entropic. That's an important point to remember. The second thing to do is to look at large forces. For large forces, this quantity, the cotine hyperbolic function for large argument, goes to 1, because this is just caused by sine. Okay? When this becomes 1, this is 1 minus kBt divided by Fa. So the R averaged is approximately n times A times 1 minus kBt divided by F times A. Okay?
Your extension is capital N, right?
Extension is R.
Capital R.
Is a capital R. I've been using slightly different notation at different points, but I've tried consistently to stick with this R, which is the end-to-end distance. So this is what happens at large forces. So notice that even if the force is infinite, only when the force is infinite does this term vanish altogether, and R reaches the maximum extension that is possible, which is n times A. That means that this is now completely stretched. And the distance between here and here, which is R, is just the number of units times the size of each unit, n times A. Anywhere less than that, this quantity is a little less than 1. Okay? Is there a?
So that is always less than 1 kBT by FA.
Yeah, this should be mod of R. I mean, the sign doesn't really matter. It just sort of tells you what is the relationship between the force and the extension to which you pull it. In this case, if you choose the force to be in this direction because you're pulling it, then the extension is also in that direction. Okay. So here, this particular quantity is always less than 1. It only reaches 1. This only reaches 1 here for n equal to infinity. Okay. So the way this would behave if we try to plot it is that I need an infinite force in order to get an extension of 1. So this is the extension R average divided by the maximum extension it can have, which is n times A. So this quantity would be 1. So the force required to reach an extension divided by length equal to 1 is infinite. This is of course much better than this idea, which says that look, you should just sort of keep going on and on and on like that. So you can see that now this model of a polymer represents the idea that the polymer has a fixed length somewhat better. It cannot have a length larger than n times A. So that does a little better, but then as I said, the experimental data seem to have some features in common with this, but not all. It doesn't really fit that perfectly. So what we will do in the next class is to try and understand why do the experiments on DNA differ from the simple model of polymers? Is there something that we have left out, and how do we understand that?
What happens for large F?
So for large F, the cotangent hyperbolic of x, for x becoming very large, goes to 1.
So it's NA times 1 minus kBT by FA.
So to do this, you need to work out what the behavior of this function is in terms of the sine hyperbolic and the cosine hyperbolic, but you can check that this is actually true. So when that happens for large F, I can replace the cotangent hyperbolic by 1. This becomes 1 minus kBT over Fa. This quantity, however large f is for large f, will always be less than 1. It only becomes 1 only when f equal to infinity. At that point where f equal to infinity, R average is Na. Otherwise, it's always a little less than Na. So the behavior of the curve is such that it sort of goes up like this, but then asymptotically becomes closer and closer and closer to this axis for R average by Na. So what that means is that now the polymer is fully stretched and it cannot be stretched anymore. So the force required to stretch it up to that point, up to that maximal stretching, is infinite. Okay? So that is our second model for polymers, and with that we can understand some of this data, at least understand why this data should behave like this, but we still don't understand it in detail. And that is what we will do the next time.